If you've never had your property stolen without anyone physically taking it, allow me to introduce you to the magical world of HOA lunacy. Imagine waking up on a peaceful Sunday morning, stepping out with your coffee, and seeing a crew of helmeted strangers measuring, marking, and stomping through the far end of your land like they owned it. No knock, no call, no heads up, just men with clipboards, shovels, and very official attitude. One even waved at me, like I was the one trespassing. That was the moment I realized something shady was going on. But the kicker? They weren't there to build anything. They were just there to keep the sun. As in, maintain the sunlight. On my land. For their benefit. And that's when I decided, if they wanted sunshine, I'd be the one handing out the shade. The house was a dream, tucked right at the edge of a suburban development with a wooded buffer between me and the uniform, soul-sucking chaos of HOA-controlled life. I had the best of both worlds, a peaceful property and no homeowners association breathing down my neck. Or so I thought. When I bought the house, I double-checked everything. My parcel sat just outside the HOA's boundary. I wasn't a member, didn't pay dues, and didn't get newsletters about lawn height or trash bin etiquette. It was bliss until the clipboards showed up. At first, I thought maybe it was a surveyor mix-up. Happens all the time, right? So I walked over and asked the nearest guy what was going on. He glanced at me like I'd asked him to explain quantum physics while juggling chainsaws. "We're mapping for solar access," he said. "This line here," he pointed to a spot about 10 feet into my yard, "needs to remain vegetation-free. It's a solar corridor." I blinked. What now?" "A solar corridor," he repeated, as if that clarified everything. "Part of the HOA's Clean Energy Initiative. We're installing community solar panels, and your property is in the optimal access path. You'll need to keep this area clear of trees, tall shrubs, fencing, anything that could obstruct sunlight." I stared at him for a full 5 seconds before I laughed. Not the polite kind, either. The kind that starts as a chuckle and ends in borderline wheezing. "I'm sorry, my property?" He nodded, clearly not getting the punchline. "Yep. You're in the sunlight zone." I took another sip of coffee to keep myself from blurting out something unprintable. "And who exactly told you you could do this?" "That'd be Karen," he said. "She's the HOA president. Signed the approval last week." Now let me tell you something about Karen. Even if you've never met her, you already know her. 40-something, shoulder pads sharp enough to cut drywall, drives a hybrid but idles in front of your driveway for 20 minutes talking on Bluetooth. Karen once fined a neighbor for excessive wind chimes, and had a gazebo removed because it was visually disruptive. And apparently, Karen had now decided she owned the sun, and by extension, my land. I paid her a visit that afternoon. She greeted me on her manicured porch like I was a door-to-door fundraiser. "Yes." "Hi," I said, keeping my tone sweet. "Quick question. Why are there surveyors on my property?" She didn't even blink. "Oh, that. It's for the community solar panels. You're in a prime solar exposure corridor, so we've designated your side yard as access." "Designated?" I repeated. "You can't just decide that." Karen smiled like a cat who'd just swallowed the HOA handbook. "The board voted. It's a community benefit. We assumed you'd be reasonable." I was so stunned I didn't even answer. I just went home, pulled up my property documents, and spent the next 4 hours triple-checking every legal line. There was no easement, no shared access, no mention of sunlight, shadows, or eco-friendly invasions. My land was mine, full stop. The next day, I called the county office. They confirmed. No permits filed, no applications for easement, no legal right-of-way through my land. The HOA had just assumed they could use my property like it was an extension of their own backyard. I was about 2 steps away from going full scorched earth, until I remembered something I'd read years ago while browsing weird gardening forums. Something about bamboo. Specifically, the clumping kind that grows tall, dense, and fast and was perfectly legal in my area. The next morning, I drove to a specialty nursery and bought every clump of Dendrocalamus asper they had in stock. It wasn't cheap, but I considered it a long-term investment in petty satisfaction. I spent that weekend planting a perfect wall of bamboo right along the invisible line Karen had drawn in her mind between my property and the HOA's solar corridor. It was technically decorative, it stayed on my land, and it wasn't violating any code. But give it 2 weeks, and it would be a wall of green vengeance. Karen jogged by on the third day of planting. She slowed down, eyeing the fresh dirt and saplings, then called out, "Those better not get too tall." "Oh, don't worry," I smiled. "They'll grow exactly as tall as the sun allows." By day 10, the bamboo was already a towering 10 feet high. By day 14, it hit 20, and the HOA solar panels that had just gone live a week prior? They weren't so sunny anymore. I didn't get a knock on the door. I got a letter. A very official, very dramatic cease and desist from the HOA lawyer accusing me of willful interference with communal energy rights. I laughed so hard I nearly pulled a muscle. But the real kicker was in the last line of the letter, where they demanded I restore the solar corridor to its original unobstructed state within 10 business days or face legal action. That was when I knew we had crossed the point of no return. They'd tried to steal my sunlight. Now it was time I introduced them to the shade. And oh, I was just getting started. By the time the bamboo reached 20 feet, it was no longer just a line of plants. It was a statement, a monument, a leafy green wall of defiance against everything the HOA stood for: entitlement, overreach, and the belief that they could simply take what wasn't theirs. And the best part? Every single stalk was perfectly legal. No invasive species, no zoning violations, nothing remotely out of bounds. It was all planted with loving care on my side of the property line, and I made sure to document every inch with timestamps, receipts, and even drone footage. If they wanted a war, I was more than prepared to fight one in the court of law, or better yet, the court of public opinion. I spent that week making subtle improvements to my bamboo grove. Mulch, decorative lighting, a small wooden bench positioned just perfectly for watching the sun dip behind the towering green stalks that now cast a long, glorious shadow directly onto the HOA's solar array. It wasn't just functional anymore, it was beautiful. Neighbors began to notice. A few even complimented the aesthetic, not realizing it had been planted out of pure spite. Karen, however, noticed for all the wrong reasons. She showed up in front of my house 3 days later with 2 clipboard-carrying enforcers from the HOA board, standing stiffly like mall cops on a power trip. I was out front watering the bamboo, whistling a tune that may or may not have been the Darth Vader theme. Karen didn't even bother with small talk. "You've been issued a notice," she said, waving a document like it was an arrest warrant. "This bamboo is an obstruction. It must be removed." I took the paper and scanned it briefly. It looked official enough at a glance: headers, stamps, angry phrasing, but there was one glaring problem. "This says I'm in violation of Article 12 of the HOA Landscaping Code," I said, trying not to smile. "I'm not in the HOA." Karen's nostrils flared like she was about to charge. "You're adjacent. Your choices impact the community. And your solar panels impact my patients," I replied. "But I'm not the one trespassing on other people's property with imaginary solar corridors." One of the clipboard minions muttered something about calling the city. Karen snapped at him to hush. I stood there, hose still in hand, casually spraying the roots of my green wall like I was feeding soldiers before a battle. The moment was so tense you could have played cello music in the background. That night, the HOA sent out a community-wide email blast. They warned of an uncooperative neighbor obstructing their renewable energy program and urged residents to be vigilant about hostile landscaping. I printed it out and framed it. Meanwhile, I received 3 texts from neighbors who, while not fans of drama, quietly admitted they were tired of Karen's reign of clipboard terror and found my methods inspiring. Things escalated faster than I expected. A day later, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. The kind where they bring out folding chairs and a podium like it's a town hall debate. I got a personal invite, which I used as a coaster for my iced tea. I did, however, attend from a distance, sitting comfortably in my lawn chair, bamboo swaying behind me like a cheering crowd. The meeting was a mess from the start. Karen opened with a dramatic monologue about solar rights, community cooperation, and something she called environmental sabotage. I didn't catch all of it, but I do remember one of the residents raising their hand and asking, "Wait, whose land is it again?" That derailed her entire narrative. Another person stood up and said, "I thought the HOA wasn't allowed to build on private property without consent." Karen's smile grew tighter with every question. She tried to pivot, claiming the board had approved a visual easement which allowed the HOA to preserve certain sidelines. This was met with collective confusion and at least one audible snort. Someone near the back shouted, "You made that up," and was quickly shushed by Karen's minions. Back at my house, I was enjoying the whole thing like a live comedy show. I could hear snippets of arguments floating through the air. Someone accused Karen of prioritizing solar panels over common sense. Another pointed out that the panels weren't saving much money anyway, especially if a lawsuit was looming. That got everyone murmuring. And then came the golden moment. Karen declared that she would be contacting legal counsel and possibly filing for a temporary injunction to have the bamboo removed. This, of course, required HOA funds. The second she said that, people started asking how much the HOA had already spent on the solar project and whether they were even allowed to use money for legal battles against non-members. That's when I knew the tide had turned. The next day, a formal letter from the HOA's lawyer arrived in my mailbox. This one was more aggressive than the first. It accused me of willful interference with communal environmental infrastructure and threatened civil action if I didn't restore the solar corridor. I called my lawyer immediately. Her name was Vanessa, and she had the steely calm of someone who enjoys making entitled people squirm. She reviewed everything, property lines, plant types, local ordinances, and smiled like she'd just found a winning lottery ticket. "They have no case," she said. "If anything, they're the ones who've been trespassing. You've got them pinned." I asked her if we could invoice them for using my land without permission. She laughed and said, "Oh, we're not just invoicing them. We're going to make them pay rent for the sunshine." While Vanessa drafted the appropriate legal response, I kept tending my bamboo. By now it had become the talk of the neighborhood. A few people even asked where I bought it. I gave them the nursery's name and told them to ask for the Karen package. They'd know what I meant. Karen, meanwhile, had gone unusually quiet. There were no more jogs past my house. No more clipboards or photo-snapping board members. Just silence. It was the kind of silence that told you a storm was brewing, but I was ready for it. I had the law, the land, and about 40 stalks of sun-blocking justice on my side. When I finally got a second cease and desist letter, this one with more legal jargon and a not-so-subtle threat of community restitution requirements, Vanessa simply replied with a notice of trespassing, an invoice for $4,300 in backdated sunlight lease fees, and a friendly reminder that any attempt to remove my plants would result in immediate legal retaliation. I had officially gone from neighbor to landlord of the light. And the HOA? They were about to find out what it costs to steal sunshine from someone who knows how to fight in the shade. The lawsuit came faster than I expected. One day I was sipping lemonade under the shadow of my glorious bamboo grove, and the next, I had a formal summons in hand. The HOA, led by Karen and her increasingly desperate board, had filed a civil suit claiming I was obstructing a vital community resource. They accused me of violating environmental laws, interfering with green infrastructure, and something hilariously vague called disruption of community harmony. I laughed so hard reading it, I nearly dropped the letter into my koi pond. But then I saw the last line. They were asking the court to force me to remove the bamboo and pay damages. That's when I knew this was no longer just a neighborhood squabble. They were playing hardball. So I called Vanessa. She read through the suit with a calm that only lawyers or chess grandmasters seem to possess. When she got to the disruption of community harmony line, she actually snorted. "This is so overreaching it's practically a yoga pose," she said. But she wasn't dismissive. She knew Karen had connections, and HOA boards had a way of pulling strings when they got desperate. So she suggested we bring in backup. That's when I met Carl. Carl lived across the street in a modest house covered in solar panels and wind chimes. He was the kind of neighbor who wore socks with sandals, smelled faintly of incense, and always had a mug of herbal tea in hand. I had waved at him occasionally, but we'd never spoken much. Vanessa, however, knew him through some mutual legal circles. Turns out Carl was a retired environmental attorney, and not just any attorney. He'd spent 30 years suing corrupt developers, polluters, and yes, overzealous HOAs. When Vanessa introduced us, Carl gave me a slow, satisfied smile. "I've been waiting for a reason to go after these clowns," he said. "You just handed me the perfect bamboo-shaped excuse." We went to work immediately. Carl combed through county environmental codes and city ordinances like a man on a mission. He found a golden clause buried in the county's zoning bylaws. Any naturally growing privacy barrier under a certain density, planted for personal landscaping on private property, was fully protected under the county's eco-privacy initiative. In short, my bamboo wasn't just legal, it was a green-certified privacy measure. Karen was in for a rude awakening. But Carl didn't stop there. He dug deeper and found something far juicier. Karen, it turned out, had bypassed the usual HOA approval process to push through the solar project. Instead of waiting for a board vote and filing proper permits, she had fast-tracked the installation by submitting a forged document claiming an easement existed across my property. That document had been used to secure a clean energy grant from the state worth over $40,000. And the best part? Carl found the original land records that clearly showed no such easement had ever existed. I couldn't believe it. Karen hadn't just overstepped, she had committed outright fraud. Vanessa's face lit up when we showed her the evidence. "This is no longer a defense case," she said. "This is a counterattack." We filed a countersuit within the week. Our charges? Trespassing, property interference, attempted fraud, illegal land use, and environmental disruption. Carl insisted we include a claim for punitive damages, just for the poetic justice. Vanessa drafted the paperwork with the precision of a surgeon. I added drone footage showing the HOA contractors walking across my land, timestamps of bamboo growth, and audio clips of Karen giving contradictory statements during HOA meetings, because yes, I'd started recording everything after her first visit. The moment the countersuit hit their desk, Karen went nuclear. I heard from a neighbor that she screamed at the rest of the board for not protecting her from liability. 2 board members resigned within days. One of them, a quiet older man named Bill, dropped by my house to apologize. He said Karen had pushed the solar deal through so fast, most of them didn't know about the forged easement. He admitted she had threatened to fine him personally if he objected. I thanked him, then gave him a tour of the bamboo grove. He actually asked for a referral to the nursery. With the legal lines drawn, the HOA's solar array sat in partial shadow, producing just a trickle of power, and their board meetings became a chaotic mess of blame and panic. Meanwhile, Carl and Vanessa were building our case like a fortress. Carl even suggested we give the bamboo grove a name for the court filings. We settled on Karen's Shade Garden. It felt right. The media caught wind of the drama a few days later, thanks to a local reporter who lived 2 streets over. She reached out for a statement after hearing about the dueling lawsuit. I gave her a short, polite response. I believe in green energy, privacy rights, and the law. Unfortunately, the HOA doesn't seem to respect any of the 3. The next morning, the story hit the front page of the local news site under the headline, Man fights HOA's sun theft with bamboo barricade. After that, it spread like wildfire. The internet ate it up. Reddit, TikTok, and even a legal podcast covered it. One clip of me watering the bamboo with a smug smile hit 1 million views in a day. People began calling me Sunshade Guy. Someone even sent me a t-shirt that read, "I rent the sunshine." Karen, predictably, did not handle the attention well. She tried to issue a community-wide gag order, which only made things worse. Residents started questioning everything the HOA had done under her leadership. Why were the dues increasing every year? Where did the solar panel grant really go? Why did Karen's house get brand new landscaping paid for by beautification funds? The board finally called a special meeting to vote on whether Karen should remain president. She made a tearful plea about protecting the vision of the community and claimed she was being victimized. But no one bought it. The vote was 12-1. Karen was out. As she packed her things and left the office that day, she walked past me. We locked eyes for a moment. She didn't say a word. Just clutched her tote bag like it was a shield and vanished down the sidewalk. But the legal fight wasn't over. Not yet. Because even though Karen was gone, the HOA was still trying to hold on to that solar grant, and that meant court. Carl smiled as he handed me a stack of papers. "Hope you like trials," he said. "Because we're about to shine a light on the truth. And ironically, the HOA's going to be the one sitting in the shade." Court was everything I imagined it would be, overly air-conditioned, slow-moving, and filled with people trying to sound more important than they actually were. But this particular courtroom? This one was different. Because the second we walked in, the judge glanced at the case summary and raised an eyebrow so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. She read the title aloud with a smirk. Homeowners Association vs. J. Mitchell, regarding obstruction of solar access by bamboo. The audience chuckled. I knew right then this was going to be a good day. Karen had a new lawyer, a stiff-suited man with a voice like dry toast and a deep desire to sound like the smartest person in the room. He introduced himself with unnecessary flair and launched into an opening statement that made it sound like I had personally declared war on the sun. According to him, my aggressive horticulture had crippled the community's green energy initiative, caused financial damage, and set a dangerous precedent for antisocial landscaping. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Across the table, Vanessa calmly shuffled our paperwork while Carl leaned back, fingers steepled like an old wizard waiting for his moment to cast a spell. Then it was our turn. Vanessa stood up, gave a brief, clear introduction, and let Carl take the floor. Carl didn't talk much, he delivered. In less than 3 minutes, he laid out the facts with the precision of a scalpel. The bamboo was legal. It was planted entirely within my property boundaries. No permits had been requested or granted by the HOA to use my land. The so-called easement Karen submitted was falsified. And best of all, we had photographic proof, satellite maps, and even emails between Karen and the solar contractor where she blatantly instructed them to keep quiet about the lines. It's not a big deal. Karen, seated at the table behind her lawyer, turned pale. Carl then called our expert witness. Dr. Willow Lentz, a botanist and environmental consultant who'd been in the field for over 2 decades. She was brilliant, charming, and absolutely ruthless with science. She explained how clumping bamboo wasn't invasive, was legally protected in our county as a privacy and windbreak plant, and had been planted in accordance with every guideline. When the HOA lawyer asked her if it was intentional that the bamboo blocked the solar panels, she answered with a straight face, "I was hired to assess plant health, not read minds. But if he did do it intentionally, I must say, beautiful execution." Even the judge chuckled. The HOA lawyer tried to regain control by playing the community card. He called a board member as a witness to talk about the financial losses from the solar panels. But under cross-examination, Vanessa revealed that the panels had only been operational for 10 days before the bamboo had even grown tall enough to cast a shadow. The financial losses were projections, not actual costs. Speculation, not damage. Worse, he had no documentation to back any of it up. Then came the moment we'd all been waiting for. Carl called for the HOA's financial records regarding the state grant for the solar panels. The opposing counsel objected, but the judge allowed it, given that our countersuit involved fraud and improper land use. What followed was 15 minutes of absolute chaos as Karen's lawyer tried to spin a tale about delegated administrative authority and procedural misunderstandings. But Carl didn't let up. He presented the real land maps, the forged easement, and even an email Karen had sent saying she'd take care of the signature part herself. The room went dead silent. Karen sat frozen, lips pressed into a line so tight they were nearly invisible. The judge asked Karen directly if she had signed the easement personally. Karen mumbled something about representing the community's best interest. The judge nodded slowly and made a note. That note, as we would later find out, was a referral to the county district attorney for potential fraud investigation. At the end of the trial, Vanessa stood and made her closing statement. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. She simply reiterated that I had exercised my property rights, that the HOA had overstepped in every imaginable way, and that the counterclaims we filed weren't about spite, they were about accountability. The HOA had tried to take what didn't belong to them. They ignored due process, violated private property, and bent the rules until they snapped. Now it was time for consequences. The judge didn't take long. She ruled entirely in our favor. Not only was the HOA's suit dismissed with prejudice, but our countersuit was validated. The HOA was ordered to pay damages for trespassing and unauthorized land use. And because of the fraudulent easement, Karen was found personally liable for a portion of the legal costs. The judge also suggested that the HOA's misuse of the state grant be investigated further. It was the legal equivalent of dropping a mic. As we walked out of the courthouse, Carl turned to me with a grin. That was fun. I forgot how much I enjoy watching the Entitled implode. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Some were reporters, others were just curious residents from the neighborhood who'd been following the story like it was a Netflix miniseries. I gave a short statement, thanking the court, my legal team, and reiterating my belief in clean energy done the right way, with consent, not coercion. Karen tried to slip out through a side door, but someone snapped a photo of her just as she was stuffing papers into her oversized tote. By the time I got home, the image was already making rounds online with the caption, "HOA Queen loses her throne." That evening, the mood in the neighborhood was different. People I'd never spoken to waved at me. A few even stopped by to offer congratulations and ask for bamboo planting tip. One guy brought over a bottle of wine and asked if I could help him install some privacy hedges. Word was spreading. Karen was finished and the HOA had been humbled. But the real cherry on top came 2 days later. Carl got a call from a state investigator who wanted more details on the grant. Apparently, the forged easement triggered a full audit. The entire solar project was now under review, and depending on how things played out, the HOA might have to return the grant money. Carl, of course, offered to help facilitate any information they needed. For free. As for me, I spent that night on my porch, watching the sun set behind my glorious bamboo wall, the panels beyond still cast in beautiful shadow. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about standing your ground, literally. They thought they could steal sunlight. Instead, they got buried in the shade. The fallout from the courtroom victory was more dramatic than I ever anticipated. Karen vanished from public view almost overnight. Her once daily jogs, perfectly timed to display her self-importance, ceased entirely. Her manicured porch remained untouched. Her porch light, once always on, now flickered dimly as if embarrassed to still be there. Rumor had it she'd resigned from the board formally via a 3-line email that included the words "toxic environment" and "irreparably damaged community trust." No one cried. In fact, the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The tyranny of excessive rules and passive-aggressive violation notices was finally over. And as for me, I had become something else entirely, an accidental local legend. The bamboo wall, now standing strong at nearly 30 feet in some places, had become something of a tourist attraction. People from surrounding neighborhoods stopped by just to see it. Some came with coffee in hand, others brought lawn chairs, as if they were paying homage to a monument of rebellion. I had neighbors ask if they could take pictures with it, like it was a famous mural. I didn't mind. I even added a small wooden plaque at the center of the grove. Karen's Shade Garden, Let There Be Darkness. Visitors loved it. One person left a review on a local Facebook group calling it the pettiest and most beautiful piece of landscape justice ever seen. But beyond the laughs, something real had changed in the community. Without Karen's iron grip on the HOA, the remaining board members finally held a public election, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, Carl won in a landslide. He didn't even campaign. Someone just nominated him at the next meeting, and the room practically burst into applause. One woman even cried and said, "Finally, someone who owns socks with personality." Carl wasted no time enacting changes. He revised the bylaws to ensure any future use of private property required notarized, recorded consent. He slashed unnecessary fines, reduced dues, and eliminated several ridiculous rules, including one that banned decorative flags and another that limited the number of wind chimes per household. The residents were thrilled. Even people who had always played it safe suddenly started putting out garden gnomes and string lights like it was a rebellion of color. The HOA, once a symbol of suffocating order, was becoming livable again. Meanwhile, I found myself with an unexpected opportunity. The story had picked up enough traction that a few local landscape companies reached out, asking if I'd be interested in consulting. Apparently, bamboo warfare had tapped into a deep reservoir of frustrated homeowners looking for creative, legal ways to reclaim their space from overreaching associations. I didn't think much of it until a friend said, "You should really just start a business. Call it Petty Landscaping or something." That night, I bought the domain name pettylandscaping.com and registered the LLC the next morning. My first slogan was simple: grow your boundaries. Business, shockingly, took off. I wasn't just planting bamboo. I was designing full-blown privacy strategies. Hedges, walls, mirrored garden art, trellises with flowering vines, all within code and all with a distinct air of glorious defiance. Clients loved the concept. Some had been through their own HOA nightmares and wanted their yards to say one thing: "You don't own me." I gave them the tools to do it with style. And because I had the legal documentation from my own case, I could confidently guide people through the red tape and keep them protected. One day, I got a letter in the mail from the State Energy Commission. I expected another complaint, or maybe a warning about overuse of green space, but instead it was an invitation. They had reviewed the grant scandal involving my HOA and were launching a new initiative focused on ethical solar implementation practices. They wanted me, yes, me, to consult on designing policy that respected landowner rights while promoting clean energy. I blinked at the letter for a long time before laughing out loud. In less than 6 months, I'd gone from a guy watering bamboo out of spite to a voice in statewide policy. Not bad for someone who used to get yelled at for not edging the lawn every other Thursday. Things weren't perfect, of course. Karen, while gone from the board, still owned her house, and though she kept her head down, I'd occasionally catch her peeking through the curtains. Once, I caught her taking photos of my yard again. I waved. She ducked. A week later, her house was listed for sale. The online listing avoided mentioning the HOA at all and instead highlighted unique privacy options and shade-friendly surroundings. I considered calling the realtor to offer an endorsement. When she finally moved out, there wasn't much fanfare. A small moving truck, a few quiet hours, and then she was gone. But I admit, as I watched the vehicle drive off, I felt something resembling closure. She'd tried to control everything. People's yards, their sunlight, their lives, and in the end she lost to a garden. A simple grove of green justice. A few days later, Carl showed up with a clipboard, grinning. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here to measure sunlight." He handed me a certificate, Community Landmark Recognition, Karen's Shade Garden. Apparently, the neighborhood had voted to make it an official point of interest. There was even talk of putting it on Google Maps. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the plaque. That evening, I sat on the bench in the heart of the bamboo grove, just as the sun was setting. The shadows danced across the grass, tall and calm. There was a breeze that made the stalks sway and whisper like they were telling secrets. I could hear the soft hum of someone down the street playing a guitar, and the distant sound of laughter as kids played in yards no longer governed by absurd restrictions. Peace had returned, not because someone enforced it, but because someone had finally stood up and said, "Enough." I'd fought the HOA and won, but more than that, I'd built something lasting. A little green rebellion that reminded people they had the right to their own space, the right to grow, to defend, to shade themselves when others tried to take their light. And as I sat there, lemonade in hand, feet propped on a rock, I smiled. Not just because I'd beaten Karen, not just because the HOA had been forced to crawl back into its lane, but because I knew that somewhere out there, someone else was planting bamboo. And they'd heard the story. And they'd know exactly why it mattered.